Sexually transmitted infections continue to climb across the U.S., and while testing for these diseases is widely available, for the most part, it requires that the patient go to a local clinic to both collect and submit their sample for testing. But is that really necessary, especially from a test accuracy perspective? Today's guests are going to answer that exact question. And I'm sure that many, if not all of us, would agree that the ability for patients to collect samples outside of a clinical setting has numerous benefits, including what the authors refer to as pseudo-anonymity, as well as increased comfort and ultimately increased access to testing, which would be of particular value for patients that may avoid clinical settings due to various different socioeconomic barriers. Welcome to Editors in Conversation. I'm your co-host, Ellie Thiel, and I'm here with JCM Editor-in-Chief, Dr. Alex McAdam from Boston Children's Hospital. Hello, Alex.
Hi, Ellie. How are you?
I'm good. So we are right now recording the day after Halloween.
Yeah.
So obviously, we have to talk about Halloween costumes. So tell me about your Halloween experience this year. And did your kids dress up?
My kids have aged out of dressing up. They both got together with friends, but our daughter took another child trick-or-treating for the first time. Her friend has a 5-year-old brother, and they took him out trick-or-treating. She was very excited about that.
Oh, that's awesome. Very good parenting.
How about you? What did your kids dress as?
So my daughter dressed up as Tigger in a onesie because in Minnesota, of course, it was 70 the day before yesterday, but on Halloween it was 35 with sleet, rain, and wind, as is always the case. And then my son, I don't know what he was. I think he was a wrestler carrying a wrestler. It was very confusing, but you know, they had fun, right?
Well, let's go off script and find out what our guests did for Halloween.
Yes. So let's start with Dina. We haven't introduced you yet, Dina, but tell us about your Halloween experience.
Okay, so I don't do costumes all that much, but I have a friend that is just a Halloween connoisseur. And this year, she's this like 5'1", she's a dancer, she has short hair, she made her hair bleach blonde and recorded the Slim Shady video as Slim Shady. And I was like, you won Halloween forever.
Yes, she did.
I have not seen anything so brilliant. If anybody wants to reach out so I can send them a clip of it, I'd be happy to share because it was true brilliance.
That's fantastic.
Dedication if you're going to bleach your hair.
I mean, I respect the love of Halloween. It's just not something I usually partake in. So,
no. Wow. Yeah. Awesome. And then Bree, you have kids.
Yeah. I have 2 daughters who are 2 and 4, and I think they were both some combination of a unicorn, mermaid, princess, sort of all rolled into one. And we all went trick-or-treating. It was the 2-year-old's first time, so it was great.
That was
super cute.
Did you have good weather?
Yeah, it's still hot here in South Carolina.
Okay.
Uncomfortably hot still.
Yeah. Okay, we can't talk about this anymore. We're going to move on now. Well, back to our script. So we hope that all the listeners that you've enjoyed previous
Ellie,
editions.
they don't know that we use a script.
Well, we do because we always say the same thing, right? So this is the scripted part of the script.
Please continue.
So we ask, though, that as listeners, you subscribe and rate the podcast wherever you listen to your podcast. We appreciate both positive and constructive, not negative, but constructive feedback. This episode is brought to you by the Journal of Clinical Microbiology, which is available at jcm.asm.org. And the podcast is supported by the American Society for Microbiology, which publishes JCM. And I just want to remind all of our listeners that if you're considering publishing in JCM as an ASM member, you will receive up to 50% off of publication fees. All right. So we kind of sort of introduced our guests today, but to tell you a little bit more about them, they are both first-time guests. And we have with us Dr. Breland Hawkman, who is a board-certified clinical chemist and is the Director of Clinical Affairs at Let's Get Checked. Dr. Hawkman, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Can you really quickly tell us what exactly is Let's Get Checked for those of us that may not know?
Yeah, so Let's Get Checked is a healthcare solutions company with a focus on direct-to-consumer testing. So amongst other things, they manufacture contents into at-home sample collection kits. So people can buy a sample collection kit to test for various analytes online. It gets sent to their home, they collect their sample, and it gets sent to then Let's Get Checked labs where the testing, sample processing happens.
Great, thank you. Also with us is Dr. Dina Green, who is a clinical professor at the University of Washington Department of Lab Medicine and Pathology, and she is the former Associate Lab Director at Let's Get Checked. She is renowned for her expertise in integrating gender diversity into clinical laboratory services, and we are just very excited to have you on. Dina, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. Any opportunity to hang out with you, Ellie?
Oh, thanks. It's virtual. It's more fun in person, but we'll take what we can get.
100%.
So today we are going to talk about a recent paper that you and several of your colleagues published in JCM a few months back. It's entitled Overcoming Analytical and Pre-Analytical Challenges Associated with Extragenital Home-Collected STI Specimens. And it really grabbed my attention because we and others in the clin micro field, I think, are getting more and more into this self-collection arena, as well as all of the validation and logistical nuances that is associated with that. And all of those things are kind of aspects that you nicely delved into. So we're just going to dive right into the paper, and we'll start with you, Dina. We're all familiar with genital chlamydia and gynococcal infections, but your study really focuses on extragenital sites of infection with these pathogens. So can you talk to us about what those sites are specifically, who's at risk, how common are extragenital CTGC infections, and how do patients typically present?
Yeah, so thanks so much for the interest in this work and for, coming up with these questions. So I think that, anybody that has oral or anal sex is going to be at risk of having these extragenital infections, and that's where they occur. So either in the oropharyngeal cavity or in the rectal space. So we take anal swabs and we take oropharyngeal swabs in order to see if we can detect the pathogen there. And they can present just like genital infections. So either you can have some amount of mild symptoms of inflammation, of infection, tenderness to the touch, pussing, other types of or discharge in the area, or it can be completely asymptomatic and you may not know. So that's and most of our commonly used assays, they don't have regulatory clearance for self-collections of these samples. And to me, that's, kind of silly, because if you think of the behaviors that led to these infections, like people are comfortable with these parts of their body.
Mm-hmm. And are we seeing kind of an increase in extragenital infections over time? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think we are, because I think we're increasingly aware that these sites can act as reservoirs for transmission. So if we think of the disease sequelae that happens from most STIs, it's reproductive health. It is damage to the reproductive system. So of course, having an infection, particularly a symptomatic infection in any of these sites, is going to be uncomfortable and somebody's going to want treatments. But for the asymptomatic infections, what we're really doing is a public health service. We are preventing the transmission of these infections to the genital sites so that further reproductive harm doesn't occur throughout our communities.
Thank you, Dina. Bree, are there recommendations for screening extragenital sites for chlamydia and GC?
There are. So the CDC recommends screening for genital infections yearly for high-risk age groups and others that are considered at higher risk. But the recommendations for screening for extragenital infections is based largely on reported sexual activity.
Thank you. And in your paper, you outline the barriers to screening and detection of these pathogens in at-risk individuals. Tell us a little bit about what those barriers and challenges might be.
Sure. So, I mean, first of all, I would say I think many people don't really want to disclose engaging in anal and oral sexual activity, even to their doctors. People may feel embarrassed or worried they'll be judged or discriminated against based on their sexual behaviors or sexual orientation. And fear of discrimination is particularly prevalent in the LGBTQ community and amongst people that do sex work. But even for straight men and women, I think a lot of people don't want to tell a stranger about the details of their sex life. And this is a problem when the screening for oral and rectal infections relies on disclosing this information. And aside from being embarrassed about to talk about your sex life with your doctor, the sample collection itself can also be uncomfortable. I mean, as Dina mentioned, oftentimes these infections are asymptomatic. So people may or may not realize these infections can be present without symptoms, or how common it is to be asymptomatic. And I can imagine that most people don't really want to, go drop their pants at the doctor's office to let a stranger, albeit a doctor, but still a stranger, take a rectal swab. It's embarrassing, especially when they don't feel symptomatic, but even when they do. And on top of all that, they're taking time out of their busy day to do it. I mean, which brings me to, I think, one final point I want to make on this, which is just that for some people, it is really difficult to get to the doctor's office for various reasons, such as where they live, their busy schedules, lack of childcare. It's not really the kind of appointment you want to bring your kids along for. And not everyone has a work schedule that's compatible with the open hours of many clinics. And getting time off work can be seriously difficult for some people.
Yeah, I think those are all excellent points, which kind of brings us to the next topic. So, Dina, one thing that the pandemic really showed us is that individuals are, just the general population is fully capable of collecting their own sample at home and even testing it at home. So can you summarize for us where we're at with the availability of at-home collection and testing for STIs, specifically for CT and GC?
And extragenital sites also, right?
Yes.
So I think that we treat adults like children when it comes to self-collection of their own samples. So I was taught at 11 years old to use menstrual products. But when I need my own STI screens, I can either go to the LabCorp that is 5 minutes away from me to collect a urine sample, or I can drive 40 minutes into Seattle to get to my provider's office so they can hand me a swab so I can go in their bathroom to take a vaginal swab and hand it to them. I have a PhD. This is Dina Green's barriers, right? I write papers on this. I direct labs. If these are the barriers that I run into, another person's not even going to be given that option to go to the LabCorp down the street to take that urine sample. They're going to be told, no, you have to have a vaginal sample. You need to go here and you need to do this, even though that person might have delivered a baby before. So it kind of blows my mind. And that was when I started to get into this, I was like, what are we even? Because, I'm a chemist and you guys just sometimes let me play in the sandbox. And
only if you're good.
I know, questionable. But so that is that. Yeah, it blows my mind that that we create these barriers. And kind of to tag on to what Breland was saying, people that are on PrEP have to have STI screening quarterly. These are healthy people that just otherwise need to have, screening to make sure we know that you're having probably more sex than maybe the average person. And so we want to screen you more because you're on PrEP, you're likely to be using condomless sex or having condomless sex. And so it's just, For me, it is, it's mind-blowing that the barriers exist to this extent.
Mm-hmm. And really the answer to the question, to the other question, is there's really not a lot of options for self-collection or at-home collection for these sorts of tests and sites in particular. So.
Thank you. So with the background we've got now, can you tell us the goals of the study that you published?
Yeah. I mean, to me, it was like to educate our laboratory community that this isn't rocket science, that we can validate these sample types and methods of collection, just like we validate the numerous other things that are required for infection control or clinical care.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So Bree, can you briefly go over the general design of the study and talk about kind of what assay you guys focused on and what you used, where you got your samples from, and just in general what parameters you looked at for the home collection of these of CT and GC for throat and rectal swabs?
Absolutely. So we used the Hologic Combo 2 assay, which is a nucleic acid amplification test. So it's a qualitative assay that detects the bacterial RNA. First, we validated self-collected throat and rectal swabs. We collaborated with the LGBT clinic in Los Angeles, where paired samples were collected by the physician and the patient at both rectal and throat sites. And then we also collaborated with the LA County Department of Public Health to compare test results. So the Department of Public Health tested the samples first, and then they sent them over to us at Let's Get Checked Labs. And then once the collection method was validated, we then did some experiments in the lab to understand how certain pre-analytical variables would affect the test results. So we focused on variables that we considered particularly relevant to home collected samples, which included determining sample stability during shipping, because of course home collected samples will be shipped to the lab for testing. And then interference testing. So we looked at products that people may have on their hands, like soaps and lotions, and checked to see if these products got into the sample, could this affect the test results? Meaning, could we get a false positive or a false negative result?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Bree. Dina, so you started by validating the self-collected throat and rectal swabs on that Hologic Panther platform, as we just discussed, for chlamydia and gonorrhea. And you compared those results to the provider-collected samples. So tell us how that comparison turned out.
It turns out that people often swab themselves more thoroughly than a doctor would. So people are more relaxed when they're swabbing themselves and more likely to get reliable detection. So for this manuscript, and this has been repeated in other self-collection manuscripts that I've published personally, and much of the self-collection literature, for all sites, we had more positive infections identified when samples were self-collected than when the samples were provider-collected.
Yeah, I think that's one really huge, advantage to self-collection, because how many could we be actually missing with a provider collect sample? So once you validated, self-collection for throat and rectal swabs, Bree, you moved on to look at a number of pre-analytical factors that could impact those results, as you mentioned. But first, you decided to establish your own limit of detection for those assays instead of using the one indicated in the manufacturer instructions for use. Can you tell us why you did that and how you established those LODs, which you refer to as empiric limits of detection?
Yeah, sure. So it's always important to at least verify the sensitivity of all tests done in a clinical lab, and ensure that they're performing at least as well as the manufacturer specification. So we purchased stock solutions of live organisms and prepared several dilutions at different concentrations, both above and below the assay manufacturer's LOD. And these solutions were spiked into known negative samples to create positive samples with various known concentrations. And then a preliminary screen was done by testing 5 replicates at each concentration. Then the LOD was confirmed by testing 20 replicates, where we defined the LOD as the lowest concentration that demonstrated 95% detection. So meaning at least 19 of 20 samples needed to test positive. And this work was done in the lab by Rogers Muldrow and Michelle Quee, who are also co-authors on this paper.
Awesome.
And I was surprised to see that the LODs that you found were much lower than those of the manufacturer. Why do you think that was?
Well, when Hologic developed this assay, they were competing with cell cultures, which are much less sensitive, and their assay was orders of magnitude more sensitive than a culture.
And I will say, if I can jump in on this one, since I do chemistry often, is that manufacturers will often slightly artificially elevate their LOD or their LOQ in order to be, because a manufacturer is going to make thousands of that same instrument, and maybe they're going to test that LOD on like 2 or 3. And so for some of our most sensitive tests, like high sensitivity troponin, for TSH, like things like that, with TSH, we've gotten these ultra sensitive assays, but really with high sensitivity troponin, oftentimes we find that the LOD is much lower than what that manufacturer had claimed. And they're doing that to take a conservative approach to this. Although in the case for molecular micro, we had to go to a point of failure. And so you could really see that.
Boy, we're getting the inside scoop on chemistry today.
Yeah.
This is awesome.
Anytime. I love to talk about it.
I almost feel like a chemist now.
Yes, you are. You come over into the sandbox, Ellie. Got room for you.
So, Dina, once you had established those empiric LODs, you looked at a number of factors, including interfering substances like soap, hand sanitizer, lotion, sunscreen, and you used 3 different brands of each of those things. Can you tell us how you set those studies up, what you found, but also why 3 different brands? And did you look for specific components or ingredients in those products?
Alex, the 3 different, I'm not always like great at following the directions, but when the FDA says pick 3 different brands, it's one of those things, just pick 3 different brands. So they were just 3 different commonly used products. We didn't necessarily pick ones that were different in ingredients, just 3 that we knew would be commonly bought in stores and drugstores and often be in people's bathrooms. So what we did with these is we made a 1% solution of buffer with these various lotions and potions, and then look to see at when we have low positive samples, does the addition of these exogenous cosmetic products kill the test? Do we still have a positive result?
The sunscreen threw me off. I don't see sunscreen going in any of those locations.
Well, I didn't, I will go back to, sometimes I just follow directions because they are the directions that were given to me. But I think you're right. I mean, it's treating, you're an adult and you have some instructions to follow, and it says, wash your hands. 1% is actually quite a lot too, when you think about that,
Yeah.
So it's not surprising that, when you add hand sanitizer, when you add alcohol, like you may precipitate out the bug and it may not get on this, into your, So it's, but it was nice to see that sunscreen didn't interfere, right? And that's I think what's most important is that you could probably do a lot of things to this swab, and as long as you put it in your genital area, and you have an infection, we will probably, or if you don't, we will probably give you an accurate result. The tests that we have are exquisitely sensitive, and they're really difficult. These are nucleic acids, right? They're really difficult to break.
Yeah. So this was all for FDA purposes. A lot of it. Got it.
Yes.
Okay. So Bree, the final component you looked at was specimen stability. Can you tell us how you performed those studies, what parameters you used, and ultimately what you found stability-wise?
Yeah. So we used negative, low positive, and high positive samples to evaluate sample stability during shipment. So the low positive samples were at a concentration of 2 times our empirical LOD, and the high positive was 10 times the empirical LOD. And we did 2 experiments that were each 56 hours in length, where one was meant to test extreme heat conditions for shipping during the summer, and the other tested the samples at extreme cold conditions for winter shipping. So simulated summer temperatures range from 22 to 40 degrees Celsius, and the winter temperature profile ranged from -10 to 18 degrees Celsius. And the specific temperature profiles for these experiments came directly from the FDA as requirements for emergency use authorizations of at-home COVID tests, actually. So, and what we found was that the nucleic acid is very stable. You could leave it in the desert for the whole summer and it'll still tell you if you have chlamydia.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right, Dina, so your study beautifully showed that at-home self-collected throat and rectal samples tested for chlamydia and GC are associated with accurate results. In fact, more sensitive than the provider-collected results. And they allow, of course, for increased privacy. What do you think are the barriers to more widespread implementation and adoption of at-home self-collected samples for STIs?
Yeah, I think this is multifaceted. And so I unfortunately do think that there is a lot of subconscious homophobia and shame-based culture around sexual behaviors that minimizes a lot of risks that labs would otherwise take for testing that is unassociated with sexual behaviors. So when I was working for one large integrated healthcare institution, I needed a rectal swab tested for Mycoplasma genitalium. They were symptomatic. There was some known things that had happened. And I tried to get our very large reference laboratory with whom I had a direct relationship with to run this swab and was told no. And then I called another medical director at that same place and was like, am I not, like, is this clinically indicated? Am I, I was like, oh, I'm supposed to, is this, and they were like, no, this is clinically indicated. They just, and that was, it was again, if Dina Green cannot call their reference laboratory to get this swab tested in a instance where it is clinically necessary, when I know this lab takes all sorts of off-label stuff and runs it either with a disclaimer or runs it with, like lots of other things, it's really hard for me to be like, oh, this is just the way that we do it, without thinking that like this is actually repressed homophobia in some ways. And so I hate that word. I don't like to, but it's a shame-based culture. So to me, a remotely collected sample is a similar modification as validating like lowering a limit of quantitation or validating a body fluid for a general chemistry test. But lab directors do end up like reacting to this line of testing very differently from that. And you have to ask some other lab directors why they do that, because that's not the way that I look at it all the time, right? So it's my way of thinking is, and so I think there's spectrums of this, like, right, maybe not sending kits to home to collect or whatever, but not being able to swab in your lab court bathroom, like these are two different things. These are two different levels of risk that institutions are not able to take a clinically collected swab to do something similar. So there are also practical reasons that remote sample collections are more difficult, right? Because like these are received in individual packages. We run factories. We have operational factories to run. And when we get a sample that is in its own packaging one at a time, that takes a lot of manual or automation effort for that. That may just not be practical for an institution. So that said, like I think that that's probably about where I am with that. Yeah. I think that I'm good with that.
Yeah. If I can follow up with kind of a straw man question, early on in the days of self-collection of samples for testing for HIV, people raised the concern that it would be too challenging for people to receive that diagnosis without being in the healthcare environment, without talking to a doctor or nurse provider or advanced practitioner or whomever at the time. Do you still hear that objection, and what do you make of it?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And so, when the CARES Act came out and we had to start releasing samples or releasing results immediately, we had a big talk about HIV particularly. And what we did, we wrote this result comment that was like, it was just, to me, it was so beautiful. It was like, HIV is a chronic disease, like, don't panic. Like, basically, it was so empathetic. It was like, this is this result, don't panic. There are so many services that are here to help you. Here's like a number to call if you need it immediately. This is, and so I think that it can be, but it is, just because a provider gives me a diagnosis does not mean that it is going to minimize the distress or the panic that I will feel when I leave that office. And so we want to do good, right? We want to protect people from these like strong feelings but at the end of the day, the diagnosis is the diagnosis. And we don't actually know what's better for that person. It may be better for somebody to receive that information in their home. And it may be better for somebody to receive that information in the clinic. And so that's where a patient also gets to make a choice. If I don't want to look at this result without my provider, I don't have to.
Sure.
So it really comes back to respecting people's choices, for them to have the care that's right for them. And, because I may not make the same decision depending on what I'm getting tested for.
Yeah, I could not agree more.
Yeah. So, when thinking about, so we're starting the whole home collection thought process, if you will. And one question that's come up is, the swabs, the collection kits that we're using, they have transport media in it. And do you think there's any risk if, so for the vast majority of patients, they will follow the collection instructions correctly. But that's not everyone. So is there any risk for patients miscollecting the samples? For example, let's say they don't read the instructions and they take the swab, they dip it in the transport media, and then they swab their throat or rectum, right? So when speaking with the FDA, which it sounds like you guys have done, has there been any discussion or concern from the FDA with respect to miscollections at home?
So yes, that is a concern. And so there's kind of the I'll just do the practical part of that first, is that the hologic buffer, you could probably drink it and it wouldn't hurt you. There's other buffers that have some more toxic chemicals inside that could potentially lead to some amount of harm. But we did a full usability study to show that people would be able to collect these appropriately. But again, is that going to be different if I'm in a clinic bathroom? Am I going to read instructions better because I'm in a clinic bathroom than I am because I'm in mine?
Is the provider going to read? Is the provider going to read the instructions? We get miscollected samples all the time.
True.
Exactly. So sure, people may make a collection error, right? They can spill the buffer, they could do it wrong. But I have bleach in my house, right? I know how to use that. Diabetics take a capillary sample multiple times a day.
Yeah.
I also drive a car on the highway. Like, we take risks where we want to take risks. And we trust adults when we want to trust adults.
Yeah. That's a really good point.
If I could add to that too.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like the concern that a few people could make mistakes collecting their own sample should not prevent the public from having this option of home collection. The benefits to the public, I feel, far outweigh the risks to the few. And home collection is new right now. I mean, people may not be great at something they do for the first time, but as this becomes more commonplace, how to collect your sample at home becomes common knowledge.
Excellent. Well, I'm on board. Sign me up for home collection. No, thank you both so much for sharing your knowledge and your manuscript with us. I think it was really a valuable exercise in the things to consider when we start thinking about how to validate these tests. So that was very beneficial. Thank you, Dina, for joining us.
Of course. Thanks so much for having us. It's great. I hope everybody has a great weekend. And I look forward to the next time I get to chat with y'all.
Of course. And Bree, thank you for joining us. Continue to enjoy that warm weather that I am so jealous of.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm ready for it to get cold. If it ever does, I don't know. I'll let you know.
Yeah, well, you can always visit. Alex, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Do we have a topic for next month?
We do not, but we will.
Can't wait. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all.
Bye-bye.